The Crusades, beyond religion, a perfect storm of motivations. Summary: the Crusades, driven by multiple factors beyond religion, saw over 100,000 Europeans abandon their lives to fight in distant lands. Amidst population pressures and economic struggles, the movement offered salvation, adventure, and profit. However, early amateur efforts failed, paving the way for organized, brutal military campaigns that transformed warfare and geopolitical dynamics. Full article: the Pope promised eternal salvation to anyone willing to march thousands of miles into hostile territory and fight to the death. Within months, over 100,000 people abandoned everything they knew to answer his call. What could possibly drive ordinary farmers and nobles alike to risk everything for a war in a distant land they'd never seen? But here's what most people don't realize about the Crusades: they weren't just about religion. They were medieval Europe's version of a perfect storm. Picture this: it's the late 11th century, and Europe is drowning in problems. The population is exploding, but there's only so much farmland to go around. Younger sons of noble families are getting nothing, while their older brothers inherit everything. Meanwhile, knights who have spent their entire lives training for war are stuck with nothing to fight except each other, turning the countryside into a constant battleground. Then there's the economic angle that history classes love to skip. Trade routes to the east were becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. The Byzantine Empire, which had been Christianity's eastern stronghold for centuries, was getting squeezed by expanding Muslim territories. European merchants were watching their profits disappear as access to precious spices, silks, and other luxury goods became more restricted and expensive. So when the Pope stood up and offered a solution that would solve multiple problems at once: get rid of excess population, give restless warriors something to do, potentially reopen trade routes, and oh yes, save souls in the process, it wasn't just spiritual fervor that made people listen. The genius of the crusading movement was that it offered something for everyone: salvation for the devout, adventure for the restless, land for the landless, and profit for the ambitious. But the reality of what these volunteers were actually signing up for would prove far more brutal than any of them imagined. What nobody tells you is that the very first crusade almost ended before it began because of rabbits. Well, not exactly rabbits, but close enough. Before the official armies even assembled, tens of thousands of peasants decided they couldn't wait for the nobles to get organized. They grabbed farming tools, kitchen knives, and whatever weapons they could find, and started marching toward Jerusalem immediately. These weren't trained soldiers, they were bakers, blacksmiths, and field workers who'd never traveled more than a day's walk from their villages. The result was predictably catastrophic. These amateur crusaders had no supply lines, no military strategy, and no idea how to feed themselves across thousands of miles of foreign territory. They tried to live off the land, which quickly devolved into looting Christian villages along their route. Local populations who should have been allies instead became enemies, attacking the very people who claimed to be fighting for their faith. Most of these early groups never even made it out of Europe. Those who did manage to reach Byzantine territory were slaughtered almost immediately upon encountering actual Muslim armies. We're talking about farmers with pitchforks facing professional soldiers who'd been fighting desert warfare for generations. But here's the twisted part: these disasters turned out helped the later, official crusade succeed. The Muslim forces became overconfident after easily defeating these amateur armies. They assumed all the European forces would be equally incompetent and poorly organized. They were about to discover just how wrong that assumption would prove to be when the real armies finally arrived. The real armies that followed were unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen: mobile cities of death marching across continents. When the official crusading forces finally assembled, they brought something revolutionary: the first truly international military logistics network in European history. These weren't just random collections of knights anymore. They were coordinated armies with supply chains, siege engineers, and most importantly, boats full of Italian merchants who saw opportunity in every conquered city. The Crusaders had figured out something that would define European expansion for the next 1,000 years: how to turn religious war into a profitable business model. Venetian and Genoese traders followed behind the armies like medieval venture capitalists, ready to establish trading posts wherever the Crusaders planted their flags. Every captured port meant new commercial opportunities. Every defeated Muslim army meant access to previously restricted markets. But the most terrifying innovation was their approach to siege warfare. Medieval Muslim cities had grown comfortable behind walls that had protected them for centuries. The Crusaders brought European castle-breaking technology that many Eastern fortifications simply weren't designed to withstand. They combined this with a psychological weapon that proved even more effective a reputation for absolutely ruthless treatment of captured cities. Word spread ahead of the crusading armies about what happened to populations that resisted versus those that surrendered immediately. This created a climate of terror that often made actual fighting unnecessary. Cities would surrender at the first sight of Crusader banners rather than risk the alternative. However, this strategy of fear would eventually backfire in ways the Crusaders never anticipated, fundamentally changing how the Muslim world viewed Christian Europe. The Muslim response changed everything, and it came from the most unexpected source imaginable. For decades after the initial crusading victories, the Islamic world remained fragmented and reactive. Different Muslim rulers were more concerned with fighting each other than organizing against the European invaders. The Crusaders had established their kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean coast and seemed to be settling in for permanent occupation. Many Muslim leaders had even begun accepting this new reality, focusing on trade agreements rather than military resistance. Then a Kurdish warrior who'd grown up in the shadow of Crusader castles began doing something no one had tried before he started uniting the fractured Muslim territories under a single banner. Instead of treating the Crusades as a regional problem, he framed them as an existential threat to the entire Islamic world. This wasn't just about recovering lost cities anymore, it was about survival. His approach was methodical and brilliant. Rather than launching immediate attacks against heavily fortified Crusader positions, he spent years building alliances, standardizing military tactics, and most crucially, cutting off the Crusader kingdoms from their European supply lines. The Crusaders had always depended on regular reinforcements and resources from Europe, but few had considered what would happen if those lifelines were severed. The psychological impact was devastating. Crusader communities that had lived in the East for generations suddenly found themselves isolated in an increasingly hostile environment. The children and grandchildren of the original Crusaders had never seen Europe, but now faced the terrifying prospect of being slowly strangled by coordinated Muslim forces. What happened next would shatter the crusading dream and send shockwaves all the way back to the Pope's palace. The news that reached Europe sounded impossible. An entire Crusader army had simply vanished into the desert. What actually happened was far worse than anyone back home could have imagined. The coordinated Muslim response had evolved beyond just military tactics into something resembling modern psychological warfare. They had learned to use the desert itself as a weapon, leading Crusader forces into terrain where European heavy cavalry became not just useless, but actively suicidal. Knights who had dominated European battlefields for centuries found themselves trapped in armor that became ovens under the deserted sun. Horses bred for the cool climates of France and Germany collapsed from heat exhaustion before battles even began. Supply wagons designed for European roads broke down in sand dunes, leaving entire armies stranded without food or water hundreds of miles from friendly territory. But the most devastating realization was that the Muslim forces had become students of European military technology. They had captured enough Crusader equipment and recruited enough European defectors to understand exactly how to counter every tactical advantage the Crusaders had previously enjoyed. Siege engines that had once terrified Muslim defenders were now being used against Crusader fortifications by engineers who understood their weaknesses intimately. The psychological impact rippled across the Crusader kingdoms like a plague. Garrison commanders who had felt secure behind massive stone walls suddenly realized they were trapped in expensive tombs. Trade routes that had generated enormous wealth for decades became death traps patrolled by increasingly confident Muslim forces. European reinforcements arriving in the East discovered they weren't joining a triumphant, holy war anymore. They were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap that had been centuries in the making. Subscribe for more hidden history and watch this next video about medieval warfare secrets.